Well, thank you. Thank you to Yotam and Roshni and everybody who was involved in organizing this for this opportunity. I hope that it's helpful to students. I am on Salt Spring Island, which is the traditional ancestral unceded territory of Halkomenem and Sinchosan speaking peoples, in particularly Samish, Chemainus, and Cowichan peoples. I will aim to leave room for questions because I really think that's the most important thing, is that you have an opportunity to ask questions you may have, even though I know there are several people in this room who have already published in scholarly journals or other scholarly publications. So there is quite a bit of shared expertise in the room as well. You may have suggestions for each other. I'm going to start by just sharing a PowerPoint, which is always a bit awkward, as you know, on Zoom, because it means I can't see your faces anymore. I will just be looking at the anonymous green dot of my camera. So if I go through any of this fairly quickly, it is just because I want to come back to seeing everybody in the room, and then you can ask me to come back to any of the points on the slide, okay? And do hang on to questions for a bit because there will be room at the end, but yeah, don't hesitate to ask questions about any of these aspects or something that you had hoped I would cover that I haven't. So, oops, share screen. There, I think you should see this. Okay, good. I'm now going to reduce that. All right. There. Quick overview of the kinds of topics that I have prepared. First, the idea of getting a publication and how we might perhaps need to reframe that, because there is a real instrumentality to sort of needing publications on the CV, and I acknowledge that's the reality, but there's also a problem with this idea of getting a publication. Differences between a good course paper, what makes a good course paper, what makes a strong journal manuscript, because those often don't sort of match one-on-one. How to select a scholarly journal, especially because there's so many out there. What reviewers look for in a manuscript. And I'm going to give examples of 2 review sheets that are from my particular field, which is philosophy of education. They won't be exactly the same as in other areas that you might write in, but I think they'll give you a sense of the kinds of things reviewers look for. And that also gets back to the kinds of criteria that might not be the ones that course instructors look for. The difference between getting a flat out rejection or getting a revise and resubmit, because those are really not the same thing. And a little bit more about this whole publishing business and the need to grow a thick skin. And then time for your questions. All right. So this idea is I need some publications. This is a reality in the current academic economy of CVs. It's needed for job applications. It's also needed for scholarship applications. And yet the idea of sort of needing to get a publication loses the idea that you need to have something to say before you put it out there for publication, right? So let's not sort of lose sight of that. When you are ready to submit a manuscript to a journal, or if there's a call for abstracts or submissions for even an edited volume or a book, it would mean that you have something to say. Those could be study results, it could be a contribution to methodology, a critique of something, an argument, but something you want to contribute to the scholarly conversation in the field. That is what I'd like to keep in mind. Now, in order to know that you're making a contribution to the scholarly conversation in the field, it means you must have a sense of the scholarly conversation on that topic in the field. That doesn't mean that every paper needs to, you need to spend half of it on a literature review, but you must be able to make some connections. If you don't make an original contribution, it may be a good course paper, but it's likely not a good contribution to a more professional scholarly publication. I would suggest that the idea, I need a publication, what shall I write, is the wrong way to go about it, right? And saying I have a great paper, where can I submit it, is a more productive way to think about it. This idea of needing to have a sense of the scholarly conversation on the topic often is also related to the particular place where you're submitting it. So if you want to submit to a particular journal, A really good place to start is to figure out what's already been written on that topic in that journal. It's not the only place to look, but that would be a surefire way to know that you're not duplicating something that's already been written a number of times. Okay. So first think about, I have a great paper, I have something to say, I have a critique of something I've read, I have a book I want to review, whatever it is, where can I submit it? That's the right way to go about it. Okay. But there's still that really, really pesky reality of saying, yeah, but in the meantime, I need to submit scholarship applications or job applications, and I really, really, really need publications. Okay, so let's think of some other ways that you might acknowledge that. The first I would say is read more. You aren't going to have something to say unless you know about what you want to say it. You need to read in order to get ideas for writing. One of the things that can come from your reading is that you actually think, hey, I have something to contribute here. I have a critique, for example. I can respond to what I've read. There is something that's missing from what I'm finding in the literature. There is a perspective that is silenced. There's something I can do here. So start by reading and figure out if you can submit a response or some other form of critique. One particular way of doing that is a book review. There are a lot of journals have particular guidelines for the book reviews they want in their journal. In my field, philosophy of education, book reviews aren't necessarily the really short, perfunctory reviews of books that are very brief at the end. They can also come in the form of essay reviews, where you can contribute your own argument in a lengthier discussion of the book. So you really can bring your own ideas into it that way. The other thing I would suggest is thinking about ideas you have presented at conferences. Quite often at conferences, you might have a PowerPoint presentation, you might have speaking notes, but you may not have a full paper. How can you turn a conference presentation into a full written out paper, taking into consideration the kind of feedback or questions you had at the presentation, and then using that for a journal submission? In fact, I think a lot of us lose opportunities to publish because we put all our energy in getting the presentation ready just before the conference, and then the conference is over and it just sits there on our desk and we don't return to it. Chances are we have ideas sitting around that are kind of half-baked. They're not there yet in the form of a full paper, but we don't have to start from scratch. We already have ideas lying around that can be fully fleshed out into a paper. A really, really common one, and I also think it's often a good way to do it, is turning thesis or dissertation chapters into papers. Usually a little bit of work is needed to turn them into a standalone paper when you take them out of a larger whole, but nonetheless, that's often a good way to think about publishing. And finally, if you're really unsure of where to start, and you're even unsure of where to start by submitting conference proposals or where to even think about publishing, think about conferences or journals that are specifically by and for graduate students. SFU has a graduate student run journal that is specifically meant to make it easier for graduate students to start to get published. They will give you formative feedback. They don't accept everything, but it's a good place. It's the SFU Educational Review. And often conferences have sessions as well that make it easier for graduate students who don't have a fully fleshed out presentation. CCGSC, the Canadian Committee of Graduate Students in Education, which is part of the Canadian Society for the Study of Education, they typically host roundtables at their annual conference where you can present sort of a partial paper and really discuss it with people. And the conference I'm very familiar with, the Philosophy of Education Society, they have work in progress sessions where they tend to match up people who have, again, a partial paper, an idea that's not quite ready for a full paper, and then pair you with a more experienced author. And those can be great places to gather ideas, to gather feedback, and then don't let it sit in your desk, then turn it into a full paper to submit to a journal. All right, so these are some places to get started. All right, now you have a course paper, and this happens fairly frequently. You have a paper and you got a rave review from your instructor, and you may think, great, I'm just gonna, take the paper, take off the feedback and submit it straight. Maybe, tidy up the 3 typos that were in there and send it to a journal. And lo and behold, you get a reject back. And you think, how is this possible? This was a great paper. it was a great paper in this course. Either my instructor is out to lunch or these reviewers are out to lunch. Like, what's happening? Well, chances are they're using two very different sets of criteria, right? A great paper in a course shows competent writing, a good understanding of the course material, an ability to analyze, synthesize, build an argument, whatever the instructions may be. The challenge is that for a journal, you need to do all of those and make an original contribution to the field. And the latter is typically not an expectation of a course paper. And so the problem can be that reviewers get this paper and read, yeah, this reads like a really good course paper. and you start to recognize this as a reviewer. And so it can get an immediate reject for the simple reason that it doesn't do anything new in the field. And it's a very well written, but well rehearsed point or critique or approach that's already known. So this is a really important thing to keep in mind, that you need to think, and I'll come back to this point of original contribution because it will come up in the review sheets that I will share with you of the venues I'm familiar with. Journals. There are so many journals. How do you know where to start? All right, step one. What journals are you reading? Now, when I say what journals are you reading, I don't imagine you actually read journals cover to cover. At least I don't when they come in. It's really hard to keep up with. But chances are that you've seen certain journal titles come across your desk more than others, simply because you've had several articles from particular journals that have been really relevant to what you're reading. Those are a good place to start. Another thing to look at is journals that are affiliated with the scholarly societies or associations in your field. A lot of the time, the scholarly associations have journals with either they publish them themselves, especially if they are open access online, or they work with a commercial publisher to put them out. And that also gives you a sense that those journals are legitimate. They've often been around for quite a while. They're a really good place to start. I can give you examples. Like in my field, there's a whole number of them for all the both the international and more regional or national scholarly societies. It is an important thing to ask yourself, do I want my article to become an open access article? Do I want it to be behind a paywall of a publisher, available only to people who can access it through, for example, their university libraries, electronic journal subscription, or do I want it available to professionals in the field? Is it important to me? It could be important in principle that you wanted open access. It could be a condition of the funding of the grant that it needs to be available open access. So keep that in mind. Some journals have open access options that you need to pay for. Those tend to be very expensive. I have never had funding to do that. It's not been an option to me. There are very good, legitimate, peer-reviewed open access journals. There's also a number of rather shady, for-profit, not very legitimate open access journals. So I'll give you a sense of what you need to look for in a minute, but it is an important question to ask yourself, open access or not. So on that last point, there are journals out there that have become known as predatory journals. And I'll give you an example. I tend to get invitations several times a week of just emails that land in my box several times a week of journals asking me to submit something to their journal. The fact that they're approaching me and asking me to submit is sort of alarm bell number one. Sometimes they're in everything from dentistry and craniofacial science to electrical engineering. I'm not kidding. So they can be from fields very, very far from your own. And it's very obvious that they don't know who you are. But they can also look semi-relevant, and it can become a little bit more challenging. So my suggestion is to steer clear of those journals. It's absolutely, they're not worthy of your work, period. I'll give you an example. In selecting a journal, read the aims and scope section. Every journal worth its salt has an aims and scope section online, typically, whether it's a for-profit publisher like a Taylor and Francis or Sage or Elsevier, anything like that, or an open access one. those are there for a reason. And I'll show you those from the two journals that, that I'm giving examples from. They are important. Once you have decided that you want to look a little bit more closely at a journal because you want to submit there, read the instructions for authors and then follow them. If the journal says we accept manuscripts up to 6,000 words, excluding references, don't submit a 10,000 word paper and hope that the reviewers will help you shorten it. That's not their job. Their job is to figure out whether it's a good fit for the journal and whether it's a good quality. So actually follow the instructions for authors. If a journal says we will only accept empirical research, don't send them a conceptual paper. If a journal says, we don't accept anything with images, don't send them images. I mean, it's really sort of, you can already help yourself quite a bit at the beginning. And I'm saying this as a reviewer where you do still see things submitted that really are not within the aims and scope and that don't follow the instructions for authors. So those things are really there for a reason. You really do need to follow them. Okay. This is an example. This just arrived on Saturday in my inbox, an example of what I would consider a not legitimate journal. In this particular case, I don't know whether it is literally predatory because I couldn't find anything about an article processing fee. And you can ask me what that is if that's not clear to you. But this was a call for paper. So it wasn't targeted, but still, it's the International Journal of Social Policy and Education. That sounds pretty broad. And it includes everything from human rights, social work, social welfare, child protection, crime and criminal justice, to all manner of areas about education. Okay. It also is inviting submissions up to May 31st for publication on June 30th, a month later. So I'm just flagging a number of these things to you. Okay, warning signs. Scope is too wide. Okay, no decent scholarly journal is going to have a scope this wide. It just doesn't make any sense. When I say, are you making a contribution to the conversation in the field? Okay, you can't have 583 conversations going on in one journal. There's multiple, but not that many, right? So scope is too wide. The journal owner is dubious. The journal owner is listed as the International Center for Promoting Knowledge. They do have a website. The website doesn't look very professional. It's also a really odd title. It's not a university. It's also not affiliated with any scholarly association that I could tell, which makes sense because the scope is way too broad. There are errors in the email itself. Journals are processing to assign a DOI number. Okay, that's not grammatical English, which should give you a warning sign about the quality of the English in the journal. And the editor is not using an institutional email address. Moreover, the name of the editor, this is page 1. If I show you page 2, the name sending me the email is not at all the name of the editor listed, and it's unclear what the position of this person is, editorial assistant or not. So it's not that it can happen that an editor isn't using an institutional email address, but then the other warning signs won't be there. So it's not always that like each of these points by itself will be defining, but there's just typically multiple warning signs. And the turnaround time. Again, I don't know any journal that is legitimate that has a 1-month turnaround time. It's just not going to happen. Okay, other warning signs. Emails that you receive that say, we have read your article, title X, and can tell you are an expert in the field. This seems to be a phrase that is used by a number of predatory journals. It just means they find anything random on Google Scholar that you have actually written, and they will take it to invite you to now contribute. So this seems more targeted, but most of the time they're not great journals. Journals that charge article processing fees, that means you would have to pay for your article to be considered, or you would have to pay for your article to be published. Sometimes those are quite significant. I, again, have never seen legitimate journals that need to do that. Don't be surprised if you actually were to pursue things and look into this and approach any of their editorial board members, if they're at good universities, that they've actually never heard of this journal and they're not actually editorial board members and their names and photos have just been stolen. And completely irrelevant fields. Like I said, I have literally had invitations from electrical engineering and craniofacial science, and sometimes send them sort of annoyed emails back to take me off their list. So that's just about predatory journals and other journals not worth submitting your work to. Okay. All right. When in doubt, ask your supervisor. If something lands in your inbox and you think, oh, would this be a good opportunity? I can't really tell. It's not quite as clear as the examples Claudia has given. Ask your supervisor and they'll probably be able to help you figure that out. Okay. I can pause for a moment to see if there's a question.
We do have a question from Tierney in the chat.
You want me to deal with that now? Let me see, Tierney. What is
No, you don't have to. You can skip to the end.
Okay, because yeah, I have to kind of go in and out to see what I can. Okay, so here's an example from a particular journal. This is a journal run by a commercial publisher, Ethics in Education. So it's a Taylor and Francis published journal. It's a legitimate journal. It used to be the journal affiliated with the International Network of Philosophers of Education. It isn't anymore, but it is a legitimate journal with an international scope. It publishes things definitely from authors from around the world. This is from their aims and scope section. This gives you some crucial information about whether or not to submit here. They are looking for articles that focus on ethical dimensions of education. If your article doesn't focus on ethics, don't send it there. If it doesn't focus on education, don't send it there. It should kind of tell you from the title, Ethics in Education, but again, as a reviewer, I can tell you that's not necessarily obvious. Now, one thing that is good to know, if you wonder, yeah, wait a minute, I write about ethics in education, but not in K-12 schooling. Well, that's fine, because the aims and scope says explicitly that they will deal with issues in both formal and informal education and upbringing. So anywhere from upbringing in the parental sphere to higher education to community education, that's all fine. They also say they welcome all traditions and forms of ethical inquiry. That gives you a sense that they will invite empirical studies as well as conceptual work, philosophical work, arguments, and so forth. So that this is one of those examples where the aims and scope give you really good information. Okay, when you submit, if you submit a manuscript to this journal, Ethics in Education, and it is sent out for review, what do the reviewers look for? These are the questions that they are asked to answer. What is the quality of the writing? Is it well written? Is it well structured? Is it accessible for a specialist audience? Is it accessible for a wider audience, right? And reviewers are asked to make brief comments on this. This particular review sheet is actually not quantitative. You're just asked to either just say, yes, this is fine, or I might say, for example, it is accessible for a specialist audience with a focus on X, but it's not really accessible for a wider audience, right? That could happen. The quality of argumentation. Is the argumentation sound, or does it jump to conclusions? Is there evidence missing? Right? How good is the argument? Does the paper focus sufficiently on educational issues? Does it have a sufficient focus on ethical issues? Right? So those are the two things that I had already highlighted. Does it engage with existing literature on the topic? And this matters. One of the things that happens sometimes is we get papers that say things like Aristotle said, da 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 da. And then as if nothing happened between Aristotle and today, along come I, author, who have submitted this manuscript, and here's my argument. And so a reviewer goes, well, wait a minute. What happened to everybody who wrote about this topic between Aristotle and you? Are they not worth engaging with? How do we know you are making a contribution to conversations in the field if you're not acknowledging those conversations in the field? And then, is it an original contribution to the discussion? You need to show you know the discussion, and then we need to know you're doing something new with it. Significance is this a trivial or an important topic to write about? That's, it's a bit of a judgment call, but I would say certainly 1 through 6 are very, very important. And sometimes, we have to say things like, I can't even judge 7 yet because it is, the paper isn't really fleshed out out yet in some other areas. So ask me again when the paper's been revised. Okay, this is ethics in it. So this gives you a sense of review criteria here. Okay, second example. There is a relatively new journal just called Philosophy of Education. This is a journal that is connected to the Philosophy of Education Society, and in fact, it publishes the proceedings, which are fully peer-reviewed, so peer-reviewed full papers from the conference. So again, if you read the aims and scope, you will realize that this journal accepts submissions that are first presented at the Philosophy of Education Society as conference papers. That means that you cannot just submit to this journal, you have to submit to the conference. Okay. Then what kinds of things do they accept? Well, they accept work that addresses philosophical questions about education. So if you submit the results of an empirical study, you will get a desk reject, right? It is not going to get into this conference and therefore journal. Again, they do also indicate that it's really, after that, it's anything and everything to do with all forms of education, formal, informal, anything from kindergarten to higher and professional education. Okay. So if you submit a paper, a full paper to a philosophy of education conference, this is, it can vary a little bit year to year, but here's an example of what the review sheet might ask. This particular one did ask people to give a rating 1 through 5 on each of these sub-questions. And I think it created a total out of 75. So that's a different way, but you'll see some overlaps. So under 3, for example, it's very much, is the paper well written? What is the quality of the writing? Is it well written? Is it well structured, right? It's the same kind of questions that we saw for ethics and education. Number 1, does the paper contain a well-formed question, a clearly articulated claim, and a compelling conclusion? This is about kind of the core that the paper is trying to do. Does it actually deliver? Does it have a clear focus? Is the argument well justified, persuasive, using appropriate philosophical tools and approaches, situated in context that is in the discipline as well as in education? Is it provocative, right? The provocative is also like, does it do anything? Does it get people thinking? Is it thought-provoking? And then, is the question or claim meaningful, which is related to that criterion of significance that I showed earlier? Is it original? Does it make a contribution? Is it important to the field of philosophy of education and likely to provoke members' interest and response? So again, it gives you a sense of like, is this a paper that will make a contribution to this conference as an event and the experience that attendees will have, right? So that again shows you that it's more than it is competently written. It's a good synthesis or analysis of work that we already know out there, but it's not particularly thought-provoking, or it doesn't do anything new, or right. So that's always the challenge with this kind of work. So this is a second example of a review sheet. Okay, so maybe I'm actually going to stop here for a second and take a few questions, and then I'm going to go to the last part. Okay, so Tierney, are these email soliciting articles ever legit? Yes, it's possible to receive an email that says, you know, we have read, not usually the exact phrasing. We have read your article X and know you are an expert in the field. That particular phrasing is kind of a dead giveaway, and I don't know, it seems to be copied like everywhere. So that particular phrasing will definitely set alarm bells off for me. But it is possible that you get an invitation that says, you know, we are organizing a special issue on such and such, and we wonder, you know, we know you've done work on this, and we wonder if you'd like to contribute. And sometimes you know the editor, or you can at least look up the editor, and you know the journal is legitimate, then that can absolutely happen. So it is possible to be invited on topics that are related to work you've done. They tend to be, like I said, they tend to be less formulaic, and then you do need to go look at whether the journal is legit. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And then conference paper publication options like at AERA. I'd look at specifics. I will come to the question in a moment about conference proceedings and whether something in conference proceedings can be submitted to a journal, all right? And it depends on the form. I would hesitate to make a generic pronouncement about proceedings, sort of AERA, because there are so many sections. And I would say it depends on who publishes these proceedings. Are they edited? Are they the full proceedings? What is their status in the field? Would you like to reserve the right to submit it to a journal that might have higher status later on, in which case don't use it for proceedings? I'd need to know sort of more specifics. Blessing.
Yeah, do you want to throw more light on how we can find the possible journal that we should probably be thinking of submitting to?
So
I can repeat that if you didn't hear me well.
no, I'm just going to go back to here.
Okay.
I'm just going to go back to one slide. So I spoke about that briefly when I said there are so many journals. How do you select a journal? Okay, so what are the journals that you read or from which you have read a number of articles? What are the journals affiliated with the scholarly societies or associations in your field? Does it matter to you whether the journal is open access? And how do you steer clear of predatory journals? And then have you read the aims and scope? Is it a good fit? Have you read the instructions for authors? Is it a good fit? So that is still what I would say about selecting journals. So I don't know how you would describe your field, the field that you're working in, Blessing, but that would be the first start. You know, where do you and your supervisory committee members and your peers, what kinds of conferences do you attend? What kinds of journals are affiliated with those conference organizing bodies? They're typically the professional societies and associations. Are there journals that you find yourself returning to over and over again because that's where the work is published that you find particularly useful for your work? Those would be the most, because those are the places where you're already engaging with the scholarly conversation. So those are also the places where you're most likely to make a contribution to the scholarly conversation.
Okay.
Does that help, or is that not getting at the specifics?
Yeah, yeah, sure, it helped. Thank you.
Okay. Itamar, what's the issue with copyrights? Does it differ from journal to journal? Yes, if you submit to a journal run by a commercial publisher like Taylor and Francis, Sage, and so forth, you will be asked to sign over copyright. So you will no longer have the copyright to your own article. Typically for open access publications, especially those where you don't have to pay for them, that are like run as a fully open access journal, you kind of share the copyright in the sense that the journal does want the copyright from you, but they say you are after that still, you're welcome to do with it whatever you want. You can send it to people, you can post it on academia or ResearchGate or whatever. The copyright forms that you sign for commercial publishers tend to give you very specific instructions for whether you are or aren't allowed to share something in a different form, like academia or ResearchGate. Sometimes it is the pre-publication unformatted version. Sometimes there's an embargo period. You're allowed to share it, but not before the year is over. So those are important things to keep in mind if that matters to you. Yeah, for sure. But you do need to read them before you sign them and decide whether or not that format is a problem. Okay, let me see if there's anything else before I go to the. Yeah, okay, I'm going to go to my last slide, Jessica, because that will come up in there. Okay. Okay. going to start by sharing this one. Okay, the first is what to do with revise and resubmit outcomes. So I just want to acknowledge that the sense that one is a total failure is very, very common among anyone who submits to journals. I'll come to sort of that in a second. These are possible and common outcomes. The exact wording can vary a little bit journal to journal, but reviewers can be asked things like, do you rate accept with minor revisions? Sometimes there's an accept with major revisions. Often accept with major revisions says revise and resubmit because they don't want to commit to publication until they've seen those major revisions. And sometimes it's a flat out reject. A flat out reject tends to mean that either the paper is in way too early a stage. It's a course paper and not a journal manuscript. Often it means it's completely not a fit for the journal, right? The person submitting hasn't really read the aims and scope, or the person hasn't read the instructions for authors and they've submitted, the 10,000 word paper where they're accepting max 5 or 6. So those are common issues with flat out reject. It is extremely common to be asked to make major revisions to your manuscript. If you get a revise and resubmit, you have all is not lost, right? You need to just take a deep breath, read the reviewer's comments, think about them for a bit. Don't try to deal with it on the same day, but it is very, very, very common. Even experienced authors receive rejections and major revisions frequently. So, I've heard somebody say once that being an academic is one of the most masochistic careers that they knew, because you set yourself up for pain and suffering and failure all the time by virtue of this kind of review process, which is, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but also kind of true. So if you receive a revise and resubmit, your first thought should be, I did not get rejected. They did see potential. I will revise and resubmit. Okay, that is not a loss. One really important thing here is learning to sort useful from useless feedback. The fact that somebody was asked to review a paper, unfortunately, doesn't always mean they are a great reviewer. Some reviewers will give you generous, wonderful, detailed feedback that will ask you to do a ton of work, but it's constructive. It explains to you why they think your paper would be better if you did X, Y, Z, or if you cut out that whole section, or if you turn the ending into the beginning, or whatever it may be. Other less useful feedback is just negative and not constructive. And it just says, this is not clear, I don't understand that. So you have to sort through it. A good journal editor tends to help you sort through the feedback because they tend to summarize the kinds of points from the multiple reviewers that they find more or less important for you to pay attention to. Doesn't always happen. Sometimes you get just unfiltered feedback and you need to think very carefully, like what here is useful to respond to and what am I just going to put aside. You can't ignore all of it, right? You can't just resubmit and ignore all of it, but you do need to think carefully about what you want to respond to. All right. Some general strategies before submitting. Ask other people to read it. I never submit anything that hasn't been read minimally by my partner, who happens to be an academic, or by another colleague. We all need more than one set of eyes to read our work before we submit it somewhere. And sometimes not just on the copy editing front, but really on, is this well structured? Does it make sense? Is that story at the beginning quite as witty as I thought it was? Does it come across to other people? Like any of those points. Never respond to reviewer comments on the day you receive them. You're just not in the right frame of mind. That's just a general some general strategies. Some people make a list of journals in their field in order of desirability. And so they might say, okay, I really would like to get published in this journal. I know it's a long shot. I probably won't, but I'm just going to put it at the top of my list. Okay, if I don't get in there, where else would I like to get published? And some people have said very, very, in a very sort of, tight process. So I'm going to submit to my top journal. If I get it back with a flat out reject without any comments, okay, I'm just going to send it to journal number 2. Once I get a sense of the feedback, I might revise once for a journal. If they ask me to revise again, I'm going to send it to journal number 3. That's one way to do it. I haven't done it that way, to be honest. There have been sort of fewer journals that I've worked with, but that's a strategy I know some people have used. One thing I'm going to ask you not to do ever is submit the same paper to more than one journal. Journals will tell you that. You often have to tick a box if you use an online upload system, is to declare that this journal is the manuscript is not already under consideration at another journal. Please be honest about that. Journal review wait times can be frustrating, but you cannot submit to another journal until you have withdrawn it from the first one. You can choose to do that. If you said, look, it's been sitting and sitting and sitting around there and I'm not hearing anything, I'm tired of this, you can let them know you can withdraw it and submit it somewhere else. Don't double dip and let it sit in 2 places. Your reputation is in the field is worth more than one journal manuscript, I can guarantee you. If a conference has only published an abstract, that means your paper hasn't been published anywhere as a paper, you could totally submit it to a journal. If a conference publishes full proceedings, a journal won't be interested anymore because the full paper is already out there somewhere. So if you do want it in a journal, then make sure that you don't submit it to proceedings, okay, if that's an option. Sometimes the proceedings are a peer-reviewed journal, like in one example that I showed you, but sometimes you can select. Okay, a few other questions. I'll jump to Jessica's first, and then I might deal with some of the others if they come up. Where do you find calls for papers, especially for special issues, right? So a lot of journals just accept submissions year round, not for any particular theme, not for any particular special issue, and you can just submit to them anytime. If you would like to know if there are special issues that might be a particularly good fit with your writing, then sign up for the association newsletters that journals are affiliated with, or journal alerts, or search the journal publisher's site. And you can often, like I said, Taylor and Francis, Sage, Wiley Blackwell, Elsevier, Springer, all of them, they have those multi-journal sites, and you can sign up. So giving you one example, if you go to Taylor and Francis Author Services, you actually have there's a central place where you can search for current calls for papers in your subject area. You can click on education, you press load, and you can click on all the journals that come up, and it shows all of their special issue calls. Okay, again, I'm going to stop sharing and see whether any of the other topics even come up, or whether there are other questions, because time goes very quickly. Okay.
Should I stop the recording at this point? Should we move into
you can decide. Do you want me to continue and talk about co-authorship, acceptable time in review, and book chapters, or would we like to just go to questions?
I'll stop the recording